In this online exercise, we'll be exploring some of the data analysis tools built into Microsoft Excel. Excel actually has a reasonably good collection of tools that allow us to take really large data sets and to slice them and dice them and collapse them and organize them and visualize them in ways that we can find trends and patterns and relationships in those data sets. So for this particular exercise, we're going to be focusing on the following tools. We'll work with the auto filter, we'll do some sorting, we'll work with pivot tables, data slicers, and pivot charts. Now, the data set we'll be using is the 2018 California Hospital Utilization Data. This is a database for over 500 hospitals in the state of California, and it contains actually a ton of information about each one of those hospitals. So all kinds of information about how many patients are treated, how many beds in various units, the average revenues collected by types of patients, their budgets. There's a lot of information about those hospitals. So there's some really interesting stuff that we can use. And what we'll do is take some real world-like examples and use it to answer some questions about hospitals in the state of California. Now, the original data set is actually available from the California Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, usually referred to as OSHPD by most people. And it's been modified slightly for this assignment. It was cleaned up just a little bit to make it a little bit easier to work with. So, but the data sets are available from OSHPD. They are public use data for the most part. For some of the data sets, OSHPD requires that you sign a statement indicating how you're planning to use the data, particularly if it's being used for research purposes or if it contains any sort of patient information. Because this is an interactive online exercise, you will need to download the data set from Canvas. The name of the file is Hospital Util 2018. And it is already in Microsoft Excel format, so you should be able to open it up directly in Excel without any problems. Now, one warning, there is a lot of data in this particular file, so you will want to use a computer that has a reasonable amount of memory and that doesn't have a lot of other stuff running at the same time. So particularly if your computer does not have a lot of memory on it, you're not going to want to have other programs running like your email or a lot of web browser tabs open at the same time, as they will make it a lot more difficult for Excel to run, and it will run more slowly. When the file opens in Excel, you'll see that it looks just like this. Now, if you notice the tabs down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that they're maybe slightly cryptic. The first one says tips. The second one says pages 1 through 6, which is the one that's currently open. Non-response, non-RESP 1 through 6, and then crosswalk. So we aren't going to be using these other tabs or the tips. We'll only be using page 1 through 6, which is actually the table with all of the hospitals. Now, I actually briefly contemplated taking those other tabs out since they're not needed, but then thought, you know what, this is the real world, and this is what data looks like when you download it from a public agency. So we're going to keep it exactly the way it is for the most part. If we scroll all the way down to the very bottom of the file, we'll see there are 497 hospitals, actually 496 hospitals in this file. I say 496 because the first row is just column headers. Now, to begin the process, the first thing we're going to do is to work with the data filter in Excel. Now, the data filter is really kind of a nifty way that we can take the file and then just use it just to narrow it down to certain rows that meet our criteria. So essentially what it does is it lets us create kind of like little mini queries like you might do in Access or another database management program. So the data filter or the auto filter is located under the Data tab on the ribbon bar. And to use the filter, the first thing that's really important to note is that you have to have a header row with the column names. Okay, and that's what appears on row 1 here. So we have fact no, facility number, facility name. So when you see FAC, it means facility, facility street address, and so forth. And if we scroll to the right, you'll see that there's just a ton of data here. We go all the way out to column MO, and I'm not sure how many columns that is, but it's a lot of columns. So once we're on the data tab, we can go ahead and turn on the filter, and this is an incredibly simple operation. It's just a matter of going over to where it says filter and just pushing the button. And the filter is now turned on. And the way you know that it's turned on is that every single column has this little arrow below it that allows you to select the values in that column. So for example, let's say I'm really interested in only hospitals that are in the city of Los Angeles. Well, I'm going to go to the hospital city column, which is column D. I'll click down the little arrow, and here are all the cities, and you can see that these are basically all the cities that any of those hospitals are located in. I'm going to unselect all. I'm just going to uncheck select all, and I'm going to scroll down until I find Los Angeles. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do the same. When you find Los Angeles, go ahead and check it on. So we now have a check mark next to Los Angeles, and click the OK button. And you'll see that what now happened is that we went from having almost 500 rows down to not that many. It's not 192. That's the last row here. What you'll see happen was it basically hid the rows that were not in the city of Los Angeles. So visually, it's only showing us the ones in Los Angeles. And you can see that every single city name now is Los Angeles. And when we scroll down the hospitals, we can see these are all located somewhere in the city of LA. And now we can go and view the information for those particular hospitals. Now let's add another filter to this. Let's say that we're interested maybe in particular types of hospitals in the city of Los Angeles. Well, we can scroll to the right. And here we have a license category. It's in column AM, and the heading says LIC CAT, and that stands for license category. When we click that down, we'll see that we basically have two categories. We have acute psychiatric hospitals and general acute care hospitals. So let's just look at the acute psychiatric hospitals and see how many of them there are in Los Angeles. We'll uncheck general acute care, leaving only acute psychiatric checked, and then click OK. And here's our result. We have 3 hospitals that met the conditions for our query. And they are these 3 here. So this is how we can use the filter to just narrow down our view to only records or rows that meet our criteria. And as you can see, we can stack these. We can mix and match multiple ones together. If I wanted to look at psychiatric hospitals throughout the state, I could go to the facility city, fact city in column D, and just check select all and click OK. And now I have all of the psychiatric hospitals in the entire state. Now, as I scroll back off to the right here, and go back to column AM with license category, you'll see that there's a little filter icon here on this filter, and that indicates that there is a filter condition set. We can make this column a little bit wider here to make it easier to read. So by checking by viewing that, we can see that there's a condition there. It just makes it obvious. So if we want to get rid of that condition, we would just change this to select all and click OK. And now we're back to our original view with all 497 hospitals. Okay, this is the data auto filter, and it's located under the data tab, right in the middle of the ribbon bar there, and it's the filter button. It looks kind of like a funnel or a coffee filter with a spout at the bottom. But that's the idea of the filter. Okay, next we're going to take a look at sorting. Now, sorting in Excel can actually be ridiculously simple, or it could be a little bit more complex and a little bit more powerful. Let's do the simple method first. Let's sort these by zip code. So if you notice that column E contains FAC zip, which is facility zip code, and these numbers do look like zip codes, all we have to do is to put the cursor anywhere in column E. Again, under the Data tab on the ribbon bar, we'll see that just a couple buttons over from Filter are these two buttons here. One is A to Z, and the other one is Z to A. And what that does is goes from the lowest to highest value or the highest to lowest value. If you forget which is which, just hover over it and it'll tell you. Now in our case, let's sort them in ascending order of zip code. So that would be A to Z, and all we have to do is click the button, and now we have all 500 rows sorted in ascending order of zip code, from 90011 all the way to the very last one, which is 96161. Now, a more powerful way to sort is by using the sort tool, and that can be found here under the sort button. If we click that, we can pick multiple levels to sort by. So for this example, let's say we want to sort by city, and within city, we want to sort by the number of beds. So I'd like to know within each city what hospitals are ranking, what the ranking of the hospitals is based on the number of beds at those hospitals. So our first level will be city. Now what we'll do is we'll add a second level, and we do that with this add level button. And now we pick another column to sort by. And you'll have to click down and look for this one a little bit. But you will find total LIC beds. It's total LIC beds. And it stands for total licensed beds. It's the number of beds that the facility is licensed to operate with. So we're going to pick total licensed beds. And now we have to decide what order do we want each one of these to sort at. Well, I think I'd like the city names to go from ascending order, and the licensed beds, I'd like those to go in descending order. I want to see the largest hospitals first within each city. So I'm going to set that one largest to smallest. Click OK, and there we have it. Now, what we can see here is that the city column is now in alphabetical order of city, and we can see all the adjacent records here. So here are 4 hospitals in the city of Anaheim. And if we scroll to the total licensed beds in column BE, we'll see that they now appear in descending order of size. So the biggest one is 262, then 223, 219, and 189. And the largest hospital there is Kaiser Foundation, followed by Anaheim Regional Medical Center, West Anaheim Medical Center, and then Anaheim Global Medical Center. So that now shows us in order, descending order, the size of those hospitals. So these are how the sort tools work in Excel. We can very easily resort pretty much any time, any place that you want to. If I wanted to sort by facility name, all I have to do is click in facility name. I can use my A to Z button. If I want to sort them in reverse order, descending order, Z to A, and now that flips it around. So now instead of starting with letter A, we're starting with the letter W. And just to make it look better, we'll go ahead and switch it back over to alphabetical order ascending. So these are the data filter and the data sort tools in Excel. Now, while we're at this spot, I'd like to point out one thing. Databases from public sources, particularly public agencies, are notorious for having a variety of problems in them or inconsistencies in formatting. Now, by sorting our name column, the facility name column, alphabetically, this actually just surfaced one of those anomalies. And as you can see on row 2, in the facility name column, there's a value that instead of the name of a hospital just simply says N equals 496. Now, this is actually a notation that was at the very bottom of the spreadsheet originally, just indicating that there were 496 hospitals in it. Now, for our purposes, this is actually getting in the way, and it's not particularly useful. We wouldn't have seen this had we not sorted. Sorting is actually one of the ways that we can identify problems in a database. Once you sort alphabetically by name, if there's anything that isn't really a real name or maybe was left blank, it'll become really obvious because it'll appear either at the very top or at the very bottom of the spreadsheet. If we scroll all the way down to the very bottom of the spreadsheet, we'll see that the very last entry is Woodland Memorial Hospital, which looks perfectly normal. So there are no issues here. But by sorting in this way, we did find that we have this one row here that has data that's not really useful to us. Now what we will do is go ahead and delete that since it's really not something that we particularly need. And we'll do that by clicking right on the row header number 2. So click on row 2, then right click on it and select delete. That then deletes the record, and now we start with our first row being Adventist Health and Rideout, which appears to be a pretty normal value. So again, sorting is one of the ways we can use to find problems in data. Very often I will do this on address columns. We can sort by address, and if there's one missing or one that has maybe some sort of garbage in it, it'll be really obvious. It'll usually be at the very top or the very bottom of the spreadsheet. And in this case, it sorts just fine. There's no problems. So we can use it to either help validate the data that's in there or to find problems. Let's go ahead and sort it in alphabetical order by name again, and we'll go to our next step, which will be to create a pivot table. The process of creating a pivot table is relatively easy, and the first step will be to insert a pivot table into the workbook, after which we'll have to design the pivot table. So we'll have to tell it exactly what columns and rows we want in it and how we want it to summarize or organize the data. So for the first step, we're going to select the Insert option on the ribbon bar. And from there, we're going to go to Insert and then Pivot Table. Pretty simple. It wants to know the range of the data for the pivot table, and it will default to the entire sheet that's currently active, which is exactly what we want. And then it'll ask us where we want to put the pivot table. We can put it into the existing spreadsheet, which is guaranteed to make a mess of everything, so I always recommend putting it into a new worksheet. And we don't have to worry about the data model at this point. We'll just go ahead and click OK. And now our pivot table has been created. Now, you notice that at the bottom of the sheet, we now have a tab that says Sheet 3, and that's what it named it by default. Let's go ahead and rename that to something that's going to be a little bit easier to remember, and we'll call this Pivot Table 1. And again, if you forgot how to rename, you just right-click, select Rename, and then go ahead and type in the new name you'd like to assign to the sheet. Now, before we begin, let's take a look at what we see on the screen and what our tools are that we have to work with. First of all, up at the top of the screen, notice that on the ribbon bar, we now have a new group called Pivot Table Tools, under which we have two tabs, Analyze and Design. And these both give us a set of tools that we can use for working with our pivot table. One allows us to do some of the more visual tasks under the Design tab, and under Analyze, we have some of the analytical tools. On the left side of our screen, where it says to build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list, this is actually where the data will go. This is where our output will end up appearing. On the right side of the screen is our field selector. And the field selector is where we will pick the fields or columns that can be used to organize the data into our pivot table. And there are 4 boxes on the lower side of that. Filters, columns, rows, and values. Columns and rows is kind of self-explanatory. Filters is where we can specify what records or what rows we want to look at. We don't have to summarize the data for the entire spreadsheet. We can pick and choose which types of records we want to summarize for. And the values is how we can define how we want the data to be summarized. So for example, if we have a column that contains average length of stay, how do we want those values organized? Do we want them summed up for different hospitals? Do we want them averaged? So we can pick and choose that in the values. And then up above here, we have the list of all of our columns, starting with facility number, facility name. These are all the ones that you saw in the spreadsheet itself, but here it just lists the columns with check marks. And the check marks are used to pick which of these fields are going to go into which area of the pivot table. Now that we've stepped through the interface, let's go ahead and create a relatively simple pivot table that summarizes hospitals by city. So one of the columns in our hospital file is the city that the hospital is located in. And what I'd like to know is how many hospitals there are in every city in the state of California. And from there, maybe we can add some additional descriptive information about those hospitals. So we'll start by taking the city column on our field selector. And what we're going to do is, what we'd like to have ultimately is just a listing of all the cities in each row of the spreadsheet. So we're going to take this, click on it, and drag it into the rows section of our pivot table builder. So go ahead, click, and then drag it down to rows. So rows should now have facility, city in it. And when you look at the spreadsheet, you should now see a listing of all of the cities. So these are only the cities that have hospitals in them. So what it did was it took all the hospitals, looked at the cities, and even if there were multiple hospitals in a particular city, it just lists the cities one time. One way to tell that is by looking at Los Angeles. If we scroll down and take a look at the line for Los Angeles, we only see it appearing one time, even though there are a lot of hospitals within the city of Los Angeles. Next, let's do a summary of the numbers of hospitals. I'd like to get a count to see how many there are in each one of these cities. Now, the best way to do this is by counting one of the values in one of the columns. I like to use the facility name for this. The reason because the facility name is that it doesn't have any numbers in it. It's just text. There's no chance that it's going to produce any issues mathematically. It won't get summed up or anything else or averaged. So I'm going to click on facility name, and I'm going to drag this down into the values section. So if you look down here, you'll see that it now says count of facility name. And on the spreadsheet, it also shows count of facility name. And for every city, there's now a value. So we can see in Anaheim, there are 4 hospitals. Antioch, there are 2. Bakersfield has quite a few. It has 9. So we've now returned a count of those hospitals. Now, let's take a look at how it knew to count these. I'm going to go ahead and click on this Count on Facility Name option here. and I will go to Value Field Settings. Under Value Field Settings, you can see that it gives us an option of what is it that we want to do with the contents of that particular column. And there's all kinds of stuff we can do here. We can average it, we can pick the minimum or maximum value, we can multiply it, count the numbers, calculate standard deviations, standard variances. Now in our case, because this only contains names, none of those will apply. There are no numbers to do anything mathematical to. So we can pick count, which would be the appropriate thing, and that's how Excel picked it. It recognized that there was nothing to sum or average or do anything else mathematical with. Under custom name, we can make this a little bit more descriptive. Instead of count of fact name, we can say number of hospitals. Click OK. And our column now says number of hospitals. So we have something that looks a lot friendlier and is a lot easier to understand. So this example does a pretty good job of demonstrating of how a pivot table can organize data using a category, for example, the city. The real power of pivot tables, though, is the fact that we can do this with a bunch of different categories. We don't just have to do it one way with one. So for our next example, let's make this a little bit more complex. And what we'll do is we'll add another variable. I'd like to get a breakdown of the number of hospitals by city based on whether the hospital is a teaching hospital or not. So the way we'll do this is by adding a column breakdown. So first we'll need to find the column that contains the indicators to whether or not a hospital is a teaching hospital. And if you start to scroll down through the list of columns, you will see this column called Teach Hosp, which predictably is just a yes or no indicator, indicating whether or not a hospital is a teaching hospital. So we'll take that, we'll drag that into the columns section, and now we can see that we have this nice breakdown, yes or no, with regard to whether or not it's a teaching hospital. So column B are the non-teaching hospitals, column C are the teaching hospitals. One of the issues with how the pivot table works is that the formatting can be a little bit confusing. And one of the easiest ways to resolve this is to maybe make the columns constant size, and then to just center or consistently justify the information within. I like to center because it just makes everything line up a little bit more nicely. So if we select columns B through D, and then click the center button, now everything aligns very nicely. And we can see that for each city, we now have a count of how many hospitals that are not a teaching hospital and are a teaching hospital. So for example, in Anaheim, we can see that we have 3 non-teaching hospitals, 1 teaching hospital, grand total of 4 hospitals. Next, we're going to add another variable to our values section. So instead of just looking at the numbers of hospitals, we're additionally going to look at now the numbers of beds in those hospitals. So first we need to find the value or the column name on our fields listing. And if you scroll down, you will eventually find TOT LIC beds, which stands for total licensed beds. Once you have that, we can go ahead and drop that into the values section right under the numbers of hospitals. So now we have both the number of hospitals and then we have the sum of the total licensed beds. So we can actually see how many beds there are in all of those hospitals by city. Now, making sense of the columns sometimes is a little bit tricky, but if you notice the first 3 columns from column B through D are for the non-teaching hospitals. That was our teaching hospital yes or no indicator. So we can see that, again, for Anaheim, there are 3 non-teaching hospitals, which have a total of 631 beds. There's one teaching hospital, which has a total of 262 beds. And then we have a total of 4 hospitals, 893 beds. Now, instead of looking at the total sum of the beds, let's look at the average number of beds by hospital. To do this, we'll click on that little arrow next to total licensed beds, and we'll select the field value field setting. Notice that it's set to sum. We're going to change that to average. And let's just give it a little friendlier name, average beds. We'll click OK. And now instead of looking at the total, we have the average. So we can see that in Anaheim, the average number of non-teaching hospital, number of beds in non-teaching hospitals is 210. But for teaching hospitals, it's 262. So we can see that the teaching hospitals are a little bit larger. Same thing in Bakersfield. We have an average of 142 beds for non-teaching hospitals and 222 beds for the teaching hospitals. Average total for all is 9 at 151 average bed size. So this is how we can combine multiple variables with multiple categories. So this is actually called a cross-tabulation because we're looking at 2 categories that are used to slice and dice our data. Now, we can reorganize visually how this appears on the screen very easily just by dragging these things to different boxes. So for example, let's take a look at maybe organizing the teaching hospital breakdown by city on the row rather than on the column. Right now we have teaching hospital on the column. Let's take that, click on it, and drag it down under city in the row box. And now we can see how the data look when it's reorganized in this way. Now, it's exactly the same values, but this actually maybe is a little bit easier to read in some ways. So for example, if we go down to Anaheim, now under each city, we have a yes or no for the number of hospitals that are teaching or non-teaching, and then we have the bed sizes alongside. So depending on how the data is laid out, one way may work better than the other visually. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. It's really which is easiest to understand. Let's scroll down to, actually, instead of scrolling down, let's do something different. Let's do a selection in order to get the data for the city of Los Angeles. So if we click on this row labels option, notice that we have a filter here. This is exactly like the data filter that we worked with earlier in Excel. We can turn off all of the cities and then only turn on the cities that we're interested in. So for example, I'm interested in Anaheim and Los Angeles. So I'm going to check the box for Anaheim. I'll check the box for Los Angeles. Press OK. And now I have the data just for Los Angeles and Anaheim, and I have a breakdown of average number of beds for teaching and non-teaching. Now I can actually format these values to make them a little easier to read. Under average number of beds, notice that there's a whole bunch of decimal places for some of these. Let's go ahead and do a little formatting. Now I'm going back to my field values settings for average number of beds. Click on field value settings and notice there's a button here for number format. I'll click that. Change that from general to number, and I'm going to do away with the decimal places. They're really not very helpful in this case. So I'm going to change the decimal places to 0, press OK, OK again, and now I have a much friendlier looking number. It's a lot easier to read and to understand. Notice that right now the field selector box has completely gone away on the right side of the screen. And the reason for that is because I've clicked off of the pivot table area. If I click anywhere in the pivot table area, that will bring it back again. So if you see that this disappears, it just means you just need to click somewhere on the actual pivot table in order to bring it back again. So we just learned how to use the filter in order to select only hospitals in certain cities. There's another tool that we can use as well, which makes the selection a little bit easier and is really useful if this is a pivot table that you plan on sharing with someone who may not totally understand how pivot tables work. If we use the Analyze option and select that on the ribbon bar, we can add something called a data slicer. And you'll see a button near the top on the ribbon bar there towards the center that says Insert Slicer. Go ahead and click that. Now we have to tell it what field or which column we want the slicer to apply to, and we will select the city column as the slicer. Click OK. And now what we see is we've got this really nifty little tool that we can use. We can move it around, and this can be useful to just select a particular city. So if I want to see Apple Valley, I can click on Apple Valley, and we can scroll through this: Bakersfield, Baldwin Park. If you'd like to pick more than one, you can use this button here for multi-select. Press that, and now I can go through and pick several cities and just choose them in whatever order I'd like. And only those cities are then shown on the pivot table. So this is the data slicer. If I'd like to clear that and just bring it back to showing all of them, I can use this button here. It's the filter with a little X to it, next to it. Click that, and that basically selects all of them, so everything now comes back. So data slicer is really kind of a neat way that we can use to allow somebody else to interact with the pivot table. Now, incidentally, you can have more than one data slicer. We could have another data slicer that that filters a different way, and the two filters will work together to produce a union of that filter condition. So that is the data slicer. Now let's do another example. We'll create a new pivot table, and this will actually be a reasonably good real-world type example of answering a question that might come up. And I think what we're going to try to find out is whether or not the majority of visits to emergency departments tend to be for relatively minor things, or whether they tend to be more severe traumas. And because the data is actually contained in this file, we can create a little breakdown of that using a pivot table. So to do this, we will create a brand new pivot table. We'll start by first going to the raw data, which is that page 1-6 tab. Once we're in here, we'll do exactly the same thing we did the first time. We'll click Insert Pivot Table to create our new pivot table. It's going to ask us what the range is, and again, the range that comes up by default is exactly what we want, so we don't have to change anything. We'll leave this at New Worksheet and just click OK. Now, let's rename Sheet 4 and call it something a little bit more intuitive. So let's call this EMS Services. And we'll go ahead and create our new pivot table now using some of the fields that we've got available to us. Now that we have our pivot table created, we're ready to go ahead and begin adding some fields. Now, in our table, there are a series of columns that indicate the number of emergency department visits based on the severity of the diagnosis. So they range from non-urgent all the way to critical. And this would give us a way to look at really overall for the state of California, what percentage of emergency department visits are for things that are non-urgent. So first we need to find those fields or those columns on our list. Now, because this list is not in any order that's really easy to find things in, one of the things that we can do to make our jobs a little bit easier is to sort it in alphabetical order of column name. So that'll make it real easy to go down to the section that talks about EMS services. So to do that, we're going to click this button that has the little gear on it. This is our settings button for our pivot table settings. And near the bottom, you'll see that there are two options for the field listing, and one of them says sort A to Z. The second one, which is the one that's already selected, says sort in data source order. Well, we want to change that to sort A to Z. This will put the column names in alphabetical order, making them a lot easier to find. The other order is just the order that they appear in the original spreadsheet, which doesn't really mean anything to us. It's not particularly meaningful. Now that we have this in alphabetical order, we see that all the fields starting with the letter A are near the top, and we want to go down to the ones that begin with EMS. And if we scroll down, we'll see that beginning with EMS visits critical admitted, we now have a whole bunch of them. Now, the fields that we want are the ones that have TOT at the end for total. So for each type of EMS visit, there are two categories: whether or not the patient was subsequently admitted to the hospital or possibly discharged from the emergency department or just sent to maybe another facility and a transfer. What we're interested in is just the total number of visits, regardless of whether or not they were admitted. So now, in order to select the fields, we can just simply go through and check each one of them. So beginning with the first EMS TOT option, which is EMS visits critical TOT, just check the box. Same thing for moderate, non-urgent, severe, and again, make sure you're checking the ones that say TOT at the end, not admitted, otherwise you'll have duplication in the numbers. Now, as you can see, it put the values across the top of the spreadsheet in columns, which isn't necessarily the most useful way for us to look at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from columns into rows. Now, notice that in the columns section, there's a little box there that says values, and that's just to show you how it decided to place them. But we don't have to keep it that way. We can click on this values option, slide it down here into the rows section, and now we have this appearing as rows. Makes it a little bit easier to see. So now we can see of the total visits that non-urgent seems to be a relatively small number. But let's go ahead and analyze this maybe a little bit more quantitatively. Another tool that we have available to use is called a pivot chart. And this is a really nice tool for doing some very quick analysis sometimes, or to build into a pivot table that will be used by others to help them visually see some of the patterns or trends in the data. To do this, we're going to click on the Analyze option on the ribbon bar. Toward the right side of the bar, you'll see there's an option there for Pivot Chart. Go ahead and select Pivot Chart. And then we'll go down to the Pie option, select Pie, and click OK. Okay, our pie chart gets created for us. Now, to make this a little bit easier to understand, let's change the format of our chart. Now, you'll notice there's a little paintbrush tool here. If you hover over it, it says Chart Styles. Go ahead and click that. And here we have some predefined formats that we can choose from. Now, this third one down, I kind of like because it has percentages on it. If you want to see what it looks like, just click on it, and it will go ahead and apply that style. If we make this a little bit bigger to make the legend more visible, now we can see that we have this really nice breakdown of our emergency department visits by urgency. So if I hover over the 6% slice, I can see that's actually the total non-urgent visits. So non-urgent visits made up about 6% of total visits in California hospitals during 2018. 38% right next to it, that belongs to moderate. So those two together total 44%, moderate and non-urgent. Almost half of the visits were moderate and non-urgent. The 27%, the next largest number, is severe. So it looks as though quite a few of them were severe. 16% is urgent, and then the 13% is critical. So this gives us a nice little breakdown, and we can really see that the majority of the visits were not for non-urgent issues. They were for things that were considered moderate or worse. So that is the pivot chart. Next, let's take a look at one more real-world type example. So we're going to create a third pivot table. To do this, we'll need to switch back over to that page 1 to 6 tab. We're now back on the original report with all the full data set. And once again, we will go to Insert, Pivot Table, and we can accept all of the defaults for this. Click the OK button. And now we are on our next pivot table, so we have a blank slate to work with. Now for this example, let's use a situation that does come up occasionally where an organization or maybe a group of organizations finds the need to lobby a politician for legislation that may help their industry or help consumers of their industry in some way. So in this case, a very common problem that occurs is knowing which person or persons in maybe state or federal government should be the ones that should be lobbied. There are a lot of congressional representatives. There's over 500 of them in Congress. How do you know which one you should be focusing your efforts on? Well, one of the ways to do that is based on their constituency. So if you can find a member of Congress and demonstrate to them that a lot of their constituents personally have something to gain or lose as a result of their decisions, then you have a little bit more leverage. Now, in this case, one of the things that we have to work with is the fact that this file also contains which congressional districts each hospital is located in. So we can use that to help identify what type of hospitals there are in different congressional districts and the type of activity they may have. Now, let's take an example here, and we'll come up with a hypothetical situation where we'll say that there is a piece of legislation that maybe will provide some support and make it easier for emergency medical services within the state of California. Now, for this, we want to identify which congressional members are going to be the ones that maybe have the most constituency that would have a personal interest. And we could argue that the congressional districts maybe that have the largest number of hospitals or maybe have the largest number of emergency department visits might be the ones that you would want to target first for lobbying efforts. So to do this, we're going to go back through our process that we used on the prior pivot table. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go to our little tools option here, and we'll change the order of our records from being in that original field order to sort A to Z. This is going to make it easier to find those EMS records. Now, let's scroll down and find our EMS records, and we'll use the same ones that we used earlier on our last pivot table. So this will be EMS visits critical,
motion detected at the front
EMS
door.
So these will be EMS visits critical, EMS visits moderate. Make sure you get the ones that have tote at the end. EMS visits non-urgent, EMS visits severe tote, and then EMS visits urgent tote. Now, they're going to appear the same way that they did on our prior spreadsheet. Now that we've loaded up the EMS visits into our pivot table, it's time to break it down by congressional district. So because the fields are now sorted in alphabetical order, just scroll on down to the C's where you should find Congressional District, and it's spelled out as Congress_Dist. Once you find it, we're going to click on that and we're going to drag it down into the rows section of our pivot table. Okay, that will now give you a pivot table that looks like mine. So we have the Congressional District going down in the rows, and for each Congressional District we can now see the number of EMS visits. Now, this would be a really excellent time to change the name of our spreadsheet. So currently it's named Sheet 6. Let's go ahead, right-click, and rename that and change it to something a little bit more user-friendly, and we'll call this EMS by CD. CD meaning Congressional District. Once you've renamed it, we can go ahead and add a little bit more to this and then do a bit of analysis with it. So it would be helpful to have a total count of all the different types of EMS visits. In order to do that, we'll have to create what is called a calculated field. So first, we're going to click on the Analyze option under the Pivot Table section of the ribbon bar. And then from there, we will select Fields, Items, and Sets. Under that option, we'll select Calculated Field. First thing to do is to assign a name to our field. So let's call this EMS_all_tote. So this will be all types of EMS visits and the total. Now the formula will simply be really just the other fields added together. So we can delete that equals 0 in there. And that's just the default formula. It'll return a 0 unless we enter something else. We'll scroll down to the section that has those EMS fields in it. You'll have to go down a little ways to find it. But once you do find it, you'll see all of those totes kind of together. And to build this, it's actually fairly easy. Click on the first one, which is non-urgent tote. Click Insert Field. And now we'll hit a plus sign and we'll add urgent to that. So again, Insert Field, plus sign, moderate, Insert Field, plus sign, severe tote, Insert Field, plus sign, and then the last one, which will be critical, Insert Field. Okay, don't put a plus sign at the end. This is all we really need. Now we can go ahead and click OK. And on our field list now, we should see our new calculated field that we just added, which is EMS all tote. And this can now be dropped down into the values option. So this will give us the total along with the breakdown of the individual ones. Now, the best thing to do here is to try to get it at the very bottom, and you might have to work at it a little bit to get it there. But once you do, we'll see now that I inadvertently did it twice, so I am going to remove one of those. We now have this sum of EMS all tote at the end. So this gives me the total number of EMS visits for all of those types. So we've now summarized it down. Now what this allows us to do is to sort based on that. So let's say I'd like to find the Congressional District in which the most number of EMS visits have taken place, because my theory is that congressional representative, that member of Congress, is going to have probably the largest number of voters that have been to an emergency room. So they may find it in their voters' best interest to vote for legislation that supports emergency rooms in some way. Again, this is a hypothetical. So now we can use the sort tool to do that. We'll go up to the data option, and I'll do the sort in descending order, largest to smallest. Click that. And now when I go back over here, I can see that San Diego actually accounts for the largest number of emergency room visits in the state, followed by the Santa Barbara district, followed by Walnut Creek. So these would be the three congresspersons that I would probably want to put at the top of my list for lobbying efforts. Now, if I was interested in who was maybe least interested in this issue, or would have the least to gain in this issue, I can sort this in ascending order. And that's going to give me the number of the congressional districts that have the lowest number of EMS visits. And those are California, probably California City, District 39, followed by Oceanside, followed by San Jose. Now, again, remember, these are not based on the residence locations of the patients. It's based on where the hospitals are located. But this would actually be a pretty good way to figure out which congressional districts maybe would be at the top of the list in terms of who to lobby in order to try to vote for the legislation that we think is going to help us and our patients. Now, finally, let's take one additional step on this and maybe also include a breakdown of the visits based on whether they're in a teaching hospital or a non-teaching hospital. So in order to make a little bit more room on our spreadsheet, what we'll first do is to take our columns and resize them to make them a little bit smaller, because they really are larger than they need to be at this point. So if we select all of the columns just by clicking on the header of column B and then going across, we can click in between any two columns, stretch, and we're actually going to be changing them all simultaneously. So by doing this, we can get them a lot smaller and make this much more space efficient. Now, because we can't really read the entire labels now on row 3, what we'll do is we'll wrap the text there. So we'll select row 3 by clicking directly on the row header, click on the Home tab, and now let's click the Wrap Text button. And that will now wrap the text within the cells so that everything is now visible. Now finally, let's align everything by centering them on the cells to make this visually a little bit easier to deal with. We'll select all of the columns, and I did this by clicking on column B, holding the button down, and then going across here to column G. And now I'll use the center tool. So now I have something that is just visually much easier to make sense of. Now finally, let's do one last thing, and let's format these numbers using a better number format. So by adding commas to them as thousands separators, it'll just make it much easier to understand the numbers and make sense of them. So again, we'll select the entire columns, and I'm going to use the comma button. Simply press the comma button. Now notice it adds decimal places, which are totally unnecessary here. So we'll get rid of the formatting of the decimal places using the decrease decimal button. Each time you click it, one of the decimal places goes away. Okay, now we have something that's much easier to understand and has a much nicer format to it. Now, what would be interesting here is if we could view this based upon whether or not we're dealing with a teaching hospital. So let's make the assumption again, just hypothetically, that the particular legislation may be different depending on whether or not the hospital is a teaching hospital or not. So to do this, we'll add a data slicer that allows us to switch back and forth between the two types of hospitals. So we'll go to the Analyze tab under the Pivot Tables section of the ribbon bar, and we're going to add Insert Slicer. Now we'll scroll down and we'll need to find the teaching hospital column that we used earlier. And here it is, Teach Hosp. We'll go ahead and select that, click OK. And here's our data slicer. We can move this off to the side. And now we can click yes or no. And we can see how the results change based upon whether or not the hospital is a teaching hospital. If you'd like, you can resize it, give it a little bit more appropriate size. And now, again, we can switch back and forth between yes for a teaching hospital or no for not a teaching hospital, and then look at the results accordingly. Because they were already sorted if you switch back and forth, they will continue to be sorted. So for a teaching hospital, District 53, District 28, and District 34 are the top 3 districts. If we say no, then it's District 23, District 10, and District 6, Petaluma, that become the top 3. So using the data slicer now allows us to limit this based upon our preference. So this is a really good example of how we can combine the data slicer with a pivot table to reduce the number of records that we have to look at, really just the ones that are most critically important to us. Now, because we're on kind of a roll here, let's go ahead and add another data slicer. And let's break these down by type of EMS services or their EMS designation. If your tools panel on the right here went away, just click anywhere in the pivot table and that will bring it right back to you again. So once again, we're going to go to Analyze and we're going to Insert Slicer, and this will allow us to see how 2 slicers can work together with one another. So we'll select Insert Slicer. We're going to scroll down into those EMS areas again, and we will look for EMS trauma designation. So this will tell us the type of trauma designation that it has. And check the box, click OK. We'll see that our new slicer appears, and now we can see that we have these options to select Level 1, Level 2, or Level 3 trauma center. So let's say we want to find teaching hospitals that are a Level 1 trauma center. Well, we just click on Level 1, we click on Yes for teaching hospital, and here we go by district now, by congressional district. Let's say we want to look for non-teaching hospitals that are Level 1 trauma centers. We just click on No for teaching hospital, and now we see there's actually exactly 1. Let's look for Level 2s. Level 2s, we've got quite a few that are not teaching hospitals. But by doing this, you can see how combining the 2 data slicers together gives us some really powerful ability to filter through the data and just find exactly the records that we're looking for. And it's very, very quick. There really is very little effort, and it's something that pretty much anyone can figure out, which makes this a really great tool to use to put together for someone else who has not maybe worked with the pivot table before. You can make it very, very easy for them to do their own interactive analysis. Now, this pretty much wraps it up for this particular exercise. So please make sure to save the file where it's at and then submit it for participation credit. Now, I do want to point out one additional thing. This is a pivot table. It was created by OSHPD, the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development for the state of California. And this is a pivot table using the same data set that we were just working with, only this one is for 2015. And you can see here that what they've done is they've created a way here to present this as a dashboard where you can actually very easily get a profile of hospitals. By default, we're looking at all hospitals for the state of California, and this gives us all kinds of information, like information about birthing data and services, numbers of live births, inpatient bed utilization by type. Again, this is all information that is in that file that we were just working with. Now, we can actually go to the pivot selection page here where we can actually make changes. So for example, if I want to just look at Alameda County, I can select that and it'll now filter it to Alameda County. So they've provided some of that same type of filtering. We did not use the filters in our exercise. We used the data slicers instead, which are a little quicker and simpler way of doing filtering. The filtering does give you a little bit more capability though, so it's definitely worth taking a look at. So again, I encourage you to explore this a little bit. I'll make it available in Canvas, but it's a really, really nice example of what can be done with pivot table technology in Microsoft Excel.